From CGTN headquarters in Beijing, this is The Hub with Wang Guan.
Hello and welcome to The Hub. I'm Wang Guan in Beijing. The world has entered a period of oil price volatility as Russia-Ukraine conflict drags on. Prices have soared following the U.S. ban on Russian energy imports, even though the recent Ukraine talks have somehow eased the pressure, sending prices slightly down. Now, to understand why geopolitical events add to asset volatility and how the Russia-Ukraine conflict affects global energy security, I'm joined today in Beijing by Zhang Jianyu, Executive Director at BRI Green Development Institute, and from Helsinki, Finland, by Lauri Myllyvirta, Lead Analyst and Co-founder of the Center for Research on Energy and Clean Air. Welcome to The Hub, gentlemen. So, Director Zhang, let me go to you first. Russia is the world's third biggest producer and the largest oil products exporter, and global energy prices have gone through the roof following the U.S. sanctions and bans. Some analysts argue that in the long run, it could trigger a supply shock equivalent to the 1979 oil crisis. Do you share that doomsday prediction?
Actually, I do not. If you look at the history, I think we arguably had two crises in the past. One was during the early 1970s. One was during the later part of the 1970s. And the challenge was then mostly from the Middle East, which by then accounted for about more than 50% of the global supply. We survived it, and arguably both crises even brought some of the better side, the green development, energy efficiency, so on and so forth. And if you look at Russia today, I think Russia's supply only accounts around 10% of the global supply, not to mention that the global energy movement has changed dramatically from what it was then. So I think the doomsday scenario more is just a sort of media extreme sort of a description of the situation, and I think we'll get back.
All right, Lauri, do you agree there? How long will we see this energy price volatility last?
If you look 1 or 2 years ahead, there are a lot of response options for Europe and for other consumers. This crisis has really put energy security at the forefront and clean energy and energy efficient solutions at the forefront in Europe. And over the next couple of years, that will really be a disinflationary force driving prices down. The crucial period is really the next months and possibly next winter, which is when the options are very limited, and there's likely to be volatility. There's likely to be downstream effect on a lot of other industries that rely on energy.
All right, Lauri, let's talk about the relations between Russia and the EU, which have very intricate and strong trade relations, among other things. The EU has claimed that it will eliminate its dependence on Russian gas before 2030 by ramping up renewables and increasing energy efficiency. How realistic is that, given that most European countries are heavily dependent on Russian energy imports?
The clean energy plans that Europe already had in place before this crisis would already be sufficient to replace the imports from Russia. The big change is that before this crisis, the emphasis in Europe was on reducing coal consumption as the most carbon-intensive fuel. And the assumption was that we would continue to rely on gas, including Russian gas, for quite some time. And now there is much more urgency around reducing the consumption of gas in particular, and the idea that gas could be a bridge fuel in the transition to clean energy is completely out of the window.
Well, Director Zhang, the European countries are not necessarily on the same page on how to deal with Russia, right? Just last week, German Chancellor Scholz rejected calls to ban Russian oil and gas, despite pressure from Kyiv and Washington, D.C. Will EU members reach a consensus on this issue?
Well, I think eventually they will. As the last speaker just said, that the consensus has already been in place. EU originally has pledged to have this so-called 55 by 2030, 55% reduction of the carbon footprint by 2030. And this crisis just happened in a sort of unpredictable short-term fashion. I think we need to zoom into some specific country-by-country scenarios, but particularly for Germany, you just mentioned. I think the challenge is really in the short run, particularly for the next winter. So that's why you look at EU's pledges, not only includes energy efficiency, the displacement of supply from other sources, but also they really need to ramp up their storage, particularly in preparation for the next winter, the heating oil.
Yeah, winter in many countries in Europe are pretty harsh over there, to say the least. Laura, let me go to you. According to JP Morgan Chase, Europe is more at risk than the United States, given that 40% of European natural gas and 27% of its oil come from Russia. U.S. imports, on the other hand, are marginal at less than 3%. Is that a catch-22 situation where Europe puts pressure on Russia, but it in fact needs to safeguard its energy security, partly from Russia?
In the longer term, those aims overlap very strongly. So what has happened in Europe is accelerating the targets for clean energy, accelerating the targets for phasing out fossil fuels on the power sector and so on. And most obviously, these very high energy prices mean that ordinary consumers are looking at a very fast switch away from gas. On oil, Europe has the option of using the strategic oil reserve, which is good for replacing a year of imports from Russia. The big fear is what happens if Russia cuts off the supply of gas to Europe. And in that case, it would really mean things like, of course, bringing as much gas in from the international market, LNG, but also things like massive energy-saving programs to lower the temperatures in buildings, rationing to industry, and so on. And that's the scenario that European leaders are currently getting their head around. Can we risk a winter without Russian gas already?
All right, let's look over to the United States. Across the Atlantic Ocean, ironically, the U.S. turned to Venezuela recently in a bid to secure alternative oil supplies and win over a key Moscow ally. That, of course, sparked a political backlash at home in the United States, and the U.S. have now backtracked. Lauri, what game do you think Washington is playing? And is the Biden administration getting desperate about securing energy supplies?
Everyone knows that the price of gasoline and price of oil in the U.S. is a huge political factor. So you would expect the administration to do whatever it can to smooth over the spike in prices, and of course not wanting to be seen as giving up on key foreign policy objectives at the same time. So that's a very hard conundrum to tackle. My focus, my hope is that after these attempts to unlock more supply immediately, the focus would be more on oil, only using the strategic oil reserve to cushion the immediate shock, and then having a plan to reduce oil demand over in a crash plan, so that we can already replace the lost supply by relying more on electric vehicles, and on behavioral shift away from cars, even in the next months and years.
Well, Director Zhang, the Biden administration is selling the plan to sanction Russia as, doing the good thing, doing the right thing, despite oil price surges. Do you think, Biden will have the political capital to deal with persistent or prolonged oil price hikes, given the political reality at home in the United States?
Well, midterm election is around the corner, and I think that certainly is going to be something that the Biden administration really needs to factor in. While the price of gasoline goes up top of the roof. We all know U.S. is a very polarized society right now, and there are different fractions within the society, different fractions within the Congress that the Biden administration need to persuade in order to move forward with the other political agenda. And I think they definitely need to try to strike a balance between this hard standpoint with Russia, where also to keep the house, do the clean house work at home in terms of the gasoline price, in the continent. I think there are many balls in the air. It's a hard game to play.
Lauri, data shows that the world gets around 80% of its primary energy supply from fossil fuels and 3% from renewable sources. Will the Russia-Ukraine conflict accelerate or derail the green energy transition?
The sky-high fossil fuel prices mean that all kinds of clean energy solutions, those that were already competitive before the crisis, wind and solar and so on, but also things that used to be marginal, such as renewable methane, biogas production and so on, are very highly profitable. So I think the only clear thing is that we will see accelerated investment in clean energy, and that's going to change the landscape in the future. The challenge is big to replace fossil fuels, but it isn't really as big as suggested by the numbers, because when you replace fossil fuel consumption with electricity, you get several units of fossil fuels replaced with 1 unit of electricity. Heat pumps, electric vehicles, and so on are far more efficient than gas boilers and gasoline-driven vehicles.
Yeah, we'll keep an eye on the latest situation in Ukraine and also its ripple effects on energy and the world economy. Thanks so much, Director Zhang Jianyu and Mr. Lauri Myllyvirta. Thank you both for joining us on Hub on CGTN. You're watching The Hub on CGTN. In the next part, I'll be talking to Chris Devonshire-Ellis on the impact of the Russia-Ukraine conflict on the Belt and Road Initiative, among other things. Stay tuned. Welcome back. After massive displacement and infrastructure disruption in Ukraine, the Russia-Ukraine conflict now threatens to disrupt the global economy and global supply chains. With Russia and Belarus under fresh Western sanctions, investors need to tread a cautious path. How is the crisis affecting transport and logistics? Will there be a shortage of essential electronic items like chips? And what could be the effect on the Belt and Road Initiative? Chris Devonshire-Ellis is founding partner of Dezan Shira Associates. Chris himself helps foreign investors make an foray into China, Russia, other Asian countries, and along the Belt and Road Initiative. Chris, welcome to the Hub.
Thank you very much.
Well, first of all, Chris, I want to share with you some statistics here. Let's take a quick look. China-EU trade. The European Union is China's second largest trading partner in 2021. China-EU trade exceeded $800 billion, up 27.5% year-on-year. In the transportation sector, China-EU traffic jumps by over 100%, with a record 15,183 train trips on the Eurasia route and 1.46 million TEU containers transported. The China-EU Railway, part of the Belt and Road Initiative, links over 80 Chinese cities and with 23 countries and 175 cities in Europe. That's impressive. Chris, first of all, your assessment on the damages done to China-EU trade by the Ukraine crisis.
I think at the moment it's still a little early to say. The crisis is still only into its third week, perhaps 5 with the 2-week preamble leading up to it. But undoubtedly, there are going to be some significant disruptions along the way and still to come. Businesses need to prepare for this, of course, but still a little bit early to say, I think, how this is actually going to pan out.
But we already see some reports saying that companies are avoiding certain trade routes. Are you upset and worried about future trends?
Well, what's happened is with the Belt and Road Initiative routes, and as you pointed out, the overland, if you like, the road routes that reach from China across Central Asia through Russia and Belarus, those have effectively come to a halt. The Russian and Belarusian ports are sanctioned, and goods, it's going to be very difficult to move goods through the European, Russian and Belarus side of the Belt and Road through into the EU. So that's being blocked off. What is happening as a result, of course, shipments going into certain ports, you mentioned Odessa, is that the Suez Canal, of course, is still operational. So there's already a well-known and well-trusted alternative. But there will be secondary routes which come to the fore. And I think here, routes such as the INSTC, the International North-South Transportation Corridor, which begins from Mumbai and then runs north-south through Iran from the port of Chabahar up to its Caspian seaports, Anzali, and so on, and then on to Eurasian ports such as Baku in Azerbaijan, and then through west to Turkey, to the Black Sea, Georgia on the Black Sea, and then can reach the southern European ports in Bulgaria and Romania. That is going to become a route of great interest. So there are alternatives, but they're not all as efficient as the road part has been at this point. So there will need to be a lot of infrastructure improvements and efficiencies made in these new routes.
Yeah, hopefully the current crisis does not mutate into a wider proxy war where countries and regions were, forced to pick sides, so that those alternative routes, like you mentioned, can remain a viable option or viable options. Is that what you're also suggesting in your briefings?
Well, I think an interesting side of this, and let's all hope and pray that this conflict is going to come to a conclusion as quickly as possible. So let's hope that that's going to happen. The result is, however, whichever way it goes, is going to be a realignment of the Belt and Road Initiative and of the supply chains between East and West. Now, that has geopolitical implications. If we're removing Russia out of that supply chain equation, it effectively brings the European Union and China closer together. They need to cooperate more. And I think this will have impacts with the European Union's Global Gateway initiative, which has been portrayed as a competitor to China's Belt and Road Initiative. But as we're now seeing, I think that rather than competition between the EU and China, we're going to have to see more cooperation between the Global Gateway and the Belt and Road Initiative. And this is actually starting to already happen. So there are there's some optimism for perhaps this conflict leading to a re-energization of EU and China trade relations.
You talk about alternative European strategies of infrastructure. The EU struck many as blowing hot and blowing cold at the same time towards Chinese investment. Is that your sense too? Yes and no. I think that the blowing cold aspect is the political issue coming out of Brussels, and some of perhaps the smaller ex-Soviet states have been concerned. They will always be that, and they can be very noisy at times. So I think that the political side, that does flag up areas of concern, and that's okay. But on the other hand, I don't think that it's practical to cut Europe off from both Russia and China. That's clearly, I think, absurd. You already mentioned that EU-China trade was $800 billion this year or last year. I should also point out that EU-Russia trade last year was $200 billion. So put those together, that's $1 trillion worth of trade
and supply chains. So cutting that off is going to be absurd. You could maybe do without Russia, but doing without China is another kettle of fish altogether. So the politicians, I think, are the ones which are flagging things up and asking questions. And to be fair, that's their job. On the other hand, the investors and the business community that are responsible for generating profits, paying their taxes and keeping the fiscal revenues of the European Union afloat, they are experiencing, they're going through boom times in China. I also feel that because of what's happened with Russia, it's allowed the EU perhaps to take more control over what China does with its Belt and Road Initiative in terms of getting involved, rather than perhaps looking at it always from a negative perspective, actually working with China to look at where the benefits really can be. And with the demise of the road part, the Russian route to the EU, I really think that the EU needs to work with China on the southern route, and we're seeing that. So on the financial and investment part from EU, that is warm, that's hot, and I think we're going to see increasing amounts of collaboration between the EU, China, and the businesses within both as a result of this.
Chris, let's talk about SWIFT. 7 Russian banks have been cut off from the global payment system SWIFT. So more Russian banks and financial institutions have been slapped with sanctions of various kinds. How will this affect companies doing business with Russian companies?
The majority of the Russian sanctioned banks are infrastructure policy banks or involved in specific areas of Russian commerce, primarily oil and gas. So they have a particular, the sanctions are focusing on diminishing Russia's oil and gas industry and partially its internal infrastructure development capabilities. It is noticeable that neither of Russia's 2 largest banks, Gazprom Bank and Sberbank, have been disconnected. They are still connected to SWIFT, and people can make payments into and to some extent out of Russia via SWIFT using Sberbank and Gazprom Bank. The majority of Russian nationals will have bank accounts and companies with one or other of those banks. So at the moment, the banking sanctions and the disconnection from SWIFT is not total, and it does not involve the 2 largest banks. So there is still the ability for Russian banks to trade if they're not involved, if they're not sanctioned or involved in goods which are sanctioned, then they can still trade, and that is continuing.
There have been talks about Russia taking up Chinese payment systems. We know that China has its own cross-border interbank payment system, or SIPS. Can that be an alternative to SWIFT, I mean, from a practical perspective?
Well, Russia has its own payment system called SPFS, which has been launched and is operational, has been for, I think, a decade now. SPFS also has international operations with banks in about 40 different countries. So SPFS, the Russian system, is very much open, it's alive, it's operational. The question which you ask is really, can Russia's SPFS system be coordinated with China's CIPS system? The answer to that has not been publicly acknowledged, but I'm sure, absolutely sure, that both governments have been looking at that as a possibility ever since 2014 and the annexation of Crimea. So the unification or the cooperation between Russia and China over the SPFS system and the CIPS system is something which I'm sure we are going to see start to come into service in the coming months.
Yeah, I mean, if the 2014 Crimea incident and the ensuing Western sanctions is of any lessons to Russia, Russia should be under no illusion that Western sanctions can be lifted soon. So how do you see the restrictions on Russia boosting the Chinese RMB, the Chinese currency, as a viable option to the US dollar or euro?
That's absolutely interesting. In fact, VTB, one of the Russian sanctioned banks, which were disconnected from SWIFT recently, they have just set up Chinese renminbi deposit accounts for their clients in Russia. So this is a move which I think will start to spread amongst other Russian banks. So the Chinese renminbi yuan is going to become, at least in Russia and perhaps in Central Asia. Russia is a member of the Eurasian Economic Union, which China has relationships with. I think that the use of the renminbi yuan in Russia is going to become more prevalent. Russia's VTB, incidentally, is offering interest rates of 8% for Chinese renminbi deposit accounts, and I think that's higher than China does at the moment. So interesting times, and I think this is a trend which is likely to continue.
Chris, you mentioned opportunities for countries in Central Asia in your previous remarks that could become new shipment hubs like the Caspian Sea region and specific countries like those in Central Asia. What is your best bet?
I think there's two really good bets. The Caspian Sea, Kazakhstan, its western port, Aktau, is on the Caspian Sea, and it's only just over 24 hours maritime to the Azerbaijani port of Baku. From there, goods can then be transferred back onto rail and shipped through Georgia, Turkey, and as I mentioned earlier, onto the Black Sea, and from there back onto maritime multimodal routes through to the southern EU. That route has some inefficiencies at the present, but I'm sure that investment and opportunities for investors will lie along that route to get that up and running and more effective sooner rather than later. The other route I think is interesting will be the international north-south transportation corridor, although that may mean geopolitical changes and attitudes towards Iran, because that can link from Baku and from the EU going south through Iran to the port of Chabahar and onto markets in the Middle East, East Africa, and over to India and South Asia. So I think the INSTC developments, opportunities, logistics, transportations, communications, and the Caspian Sea, for sure, I think are going to be development and investment hotspots in this year and beyond.
It's very important to get truly well informed at this point and time. Chris Devonshire-Ellis, founding partner of Dezan Shira and Associates, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. And that's all we have for this edition of The Hub. Tell us what you think by sending us a message on Weibo, Douyin, Twitter, or Facebook. Thank you for joining us. I'm Wang Guan in Beijing. Our news coverage continues on CGTN. Bye and take care.